Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to the fourth in our series of online talks showcasing the research and interests of colleagues here at University College. And I'm delighted to be joined this evening by Dr. Aneurine Ellis-Evans, Professor in Ancient History, Associate Professor in Ancient History, who is a George Cawkwell Tutorial Fellow in Ancient History here at Univ. Aneurine joined Univ in 2022 after holding posts in several Oxford colleges. And we have the most amazing talk for you tonight, titled Cleo Was Pregnant for 5 years. Well, there's something to conjure with. How did women experience medicine in classical Greece? Aneurine, over to you. We'll hear from Aneurine for about 25 minutes, and then we will take questions. Welcome, Aneurine.
Great. Okay, I'll just share my screen. Right. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. And thanks, Valerie, too, for that introduction. So in addition to teaching Greek and Roman history to Univ undergraduates, one of the other things that I do in my job is I convene a finals option for the classics faculty, which is about gender and sexuality throughout antiquity. And it's in the course of teaching that paper that I became really interested in the subject of medicine in classical Greece and what that can contribute to our understanding of gender history in antiquity. And so that's what I'm going to talk about this evening. So the first thing to say is that medicine is one of those dangerous topics in history where we all think we know what it's about because we've all experienced it. And as a result, we can quite easily miss the ways in which it worked differently in a past society. So we live in a world where when we get sick, we invariably look to medical science to make us well again. When we're ill, we think in scientific ways about our symptoms. We go to scientifically trained people for treatment, and we expect that treatment to take the form of scientifically approved therapies. Now, that doesn't mean that some, or maybe quite a lot of us, don't also make use of superstition, alternative medicine, the power of prayer, or other methods of healing which aren't grounded in the scientific method. But for most people, these are typically supplements to the treatment provided by medical science, rather than the primary way that we seek healing. That isn't at all how things worked in classical Greece. The ancient Greek equivalent of medical science, Hippocratic medicine, was viewed as having about the same level of authority as religion or alternative medicine when it came to healing. So if you got sick, you were as likely to make a dedication in a sanctuary or to buy a magical amulet as you were to go and find a doctor. From the perspective of someone living in classical Greece, all three of those options seemed equally efficacious. So what adds to this dynamic is the fact that both Hippocratic medicine and the most common type of healing sanctuaries in classical Greece, those of the god Asclepius, were brand new. They both are phenomena that first appear in the early 5th century BC, and then they quickly spread around the Greek world thereafter. So a major consequence of this is that both Hippocratic doctors and the priests that ran sanctuaries of Asclepius were very keen to establish the authority and legitimacy of the healing methods that they were peddling. And as a result, both groups were obsessed with establishing their authority as sources of healing, precisely because they couldn't take that for granted from the people that they were that took from their patients. So these questions of authority in Hippocratic medicine and temple medicine are especially magnified when we look at female patients with gynecological illnesses. So in a patriarchal society like classical Greece, where a woman's primary duty is viewed as producing children to continue the family line, there's a huge amount at stake in gynecological illnesses, partly because they threaten the life of the mother, but also because the health of the mother and her ability to bear healthy children is what the entire fortunes of the family hinge on. So, given that, probably won't surprise you to discover that both Hippocratic doctors and sanctuaries of Asclepius were very keen to establish that they could successfully treat gynecological illnesses. But to complicate matters, there's a really significant cultural dimension to this particular type of case. Firstly, there are few more taboo subjects in any society than a woman's sexuality and her reproductive health. And secondly, gynecological illnesses involve an experience of illness and the body, which men can only know at secondhand from women. And so, as we'll see, in a patriarchal society like classical Greece, these two factors combine to create all sorts of problems for the male healers who want to establish their authority in this sphere of healing. So, to understand how these kind of questions of authority affected the female experience of medicine in classical Greece, I'm going to talk to you about a very unusual gynecological illness, women who experience multi-year pregnancies. So let's begin with talking about healing sanctuaries. So in Greek religion, any god could be involved in healing. However, from the early 5th century onwards, the god who was primarily associated with healing was Asclepius. So the cult of Asclepius spread all over the Greek world in the classical period, and most reasonably sized cities have some sort of sanctuary of Asclepius in them. But not all of them were viewed as being kind of equal importance or power or kind of, medical effectiveness. In particular, the sanctuary of Asclepius at Epidauros in the northwestern Peloponnese became especially famous and well known for its healing. And as a result, of all of the patients who kind of flocked to Epidauros to be healed, the sanctuary quickly became extremely wealthy, and this fueled a kind of a sort of a massive building program in the 4th century. So if you've been to Epidauros, which if you haven't, strongly recommend it, you'll have seen this absolutely enormous 14,000 person seater theatre, which they were able to build in the late 4th century as a result of all of those patients who come to the sanctuary, make dedications and spend money there. So the entire experience of being a patient at Epidauros was meant to reinforce your belief that you were undergoing a transformative ritual, which would ultimately result in you being healed. When you arrived at Epidauros, you bathed and changed into ritually pure clothes before entering the sanctuary, all of which, of course, cost you money. And then as you walked through the sanctuary, you would pass hundreds of thank offerings made by people who had been cured. And then as evening approached, you would move towards a building known as the Abaton, which I've marked on this reconstruction. And this was where you would sleep overnight in the hope of being healed by Asclepius in a dream. And then if you had any doubts about the god's healing powers, the priests could read to you hundreds of successful miracle cures recorded on large stone stelae in the abaton. Now, this space was probably sex segregated, so we should also imagine that female patients would have spent time talking to one another about their illnesses and sharing their hopes of being cured. And because most of these illnesses are kind of chronic ones, there's quite a lot of overlap in terms of the types of things that they're ill with, and so they would likely encounter someone else who is experiencing a similar illness to them. So this whole experience is designed to induce belief in Asclepius and prime you to have certain sorts of dreams. And if you did indeed wake up believing yourself to be cured, then you would add a thank offering to the many which already existed in the sanctuary. So this is one I particularly enjoy, of Asclepius hugging a disembodied leg. There are loads more like this. So equally, though, if you weren't cured, then what the priests could do is point to the evidence of all the successful cures around the sanctuary and encourage you to try again the next night. And so, at later points in antiquity, we've got examples of people spending months at a time in these sanctuaries trying again and again to be healed. So, as I just mentioned, large stone stelae were set up in the abaton recording miracle cures which Asclepius had performed. These stelae were set up in the second half of the 4th century, so at exactly the same time as that big building boom in the sanctuary. And 4 of them have survived, and as you can see, even the ones that have survived are not complete. So there's 2 important things to note about these inscriptions. Firstly, they were designed to be eye-catching. So each of these stelae is 5 foot high, and they're made of a marble which otherwise wasn't used for inscriptions anywhere else in the sanctuary. And the second thing to note is they're meant to be legible. The letters are inscribed in a nice clear grid pattern, and there's a gap left between each of the cure narratives to help the reader navigate through the text. So as a patient, you were clearly meant to notice these inscriptions, and then either read it for yourself if you were literate, or if, as was more likely the case, you were illiterate, ask a priest or another patient to tell you what they said. So when you read through these cure narratives, it quickly becomes clear that they all have a didactic purpose. They teach the reader about the miraculous healing power of the god, about the bad things that happen to people who doubt the god, and about what to expect should the god heal them. And a good example of this is the case of Ambrosia of Athens. So Ambrosia was a woman who doubted the power of the god and learned her lesson. So here we go. Ambrosia from Athens, blind in one eye. She came as a suppliant to the god. Walking about the sanctuary, she ridiculed some of the cures as being unlikely and impossible, the lame and blind becoming well from only seeing a dream. Sleeping here, she saw a vision. It seemed to her the god came to her and said he would make her well, but she would have to pay a fee by dedicating a silver pig in the sanctuary as a memorial of her ignorance. When he had said these things, he cut her sick eye and poured a medicine over it. When day came, she felt well. So, 2 things to note here. The first is the fact that the priests wanted to tell a story about someone doubting the power of the god and being proved wrong strongly implies that people did doubt the power of the god. So not everyone bought into the validity of Asclepius's miracles. Secondly, the story is very typical of the way in which miracle cures teach a patient what to expect and how to act. You're going to go to sleep, you'll see a vision of the god, and when you wake up cured, don't forget to say thank you. So the very first text on the stele concerns the Cleo of my title, who had been pregnant for 5 years. Cleo was pregnant for 5 years. After the 5th year of pregnancy, she came as a suppliant to the god and incubated, so slept overnight in the Abaton. As soon as she had left it and was outside the sacred area, she gave birth to a son who, as soon as he was born, washed himself at the fountain and toddled about with his mother. After this success, she inscribed upon an offering, "The wonder is not the size of the pinax, so the plaque that she's dedicated, but the act of the god. For 5 years, Cleo bore a burden in her stomach until she incubated here and he made her well." So there's a few things to note here. First, the 5-year length of the pregnancy is stated as a straightforward fact. Secondly, the actual cure itself isn't described. So elsewhere in these texts, when a female patient is suffering from a non-gynecological illness, the cure is described. So for example, we've just seen in the case of Ambrosia, it's described how Asclepius cuts open her eye, pours in the medicine, and then she wakes up. By contrast, whenever in these texts the illness is gynecological, the cure is passed over in silence, and presumably the reason to do that is to preserve the female patient's modesty. Third, when Cleo gives birth to the child, it's able to wash itself and toddle about just like a real 5-year-old would be able to. So part of the miracle is that the child has continued developing in the whole time in the womb. She is literally giving birth to a fully developed 5-year-old child. And then finally, the text makes sure to mention that Cleo was appropriately grateful and made a thank offering to the god, which the text then quotes as proof that this miracle happened. So, to state the obvious, it's pretty clear that this cure didn't actually happen, or at least it certainly didn't happen in the way that it's been told here. Pregnancies don't last 5 years, and a woman definitely can't give birth to a fully developed 5-year-old child. However, while the case itself may not be about a real woman's experience of being healed in the sanctuary, the text did have an audience of real female patients in the Abaton. So a different and better question to ask is, what would these female patients have learned from this text? And I think there's probably 3 things. One, miracles can happen, and this is the proof. 2, if you're healed, remember to give thanks. And 3, Asclepius respects female modesty, and he's going to handle a gynecological illness like this in a sensitive way that doesn't shame you in public. So let's now turn to Hippocratic medicine. This was a new intellectual phenomenon which first emerged in the classical period. It was supposedly invented by Hippocrates of Kos, but in reality, we know very little about who Hippocrates was and what he actually wrote, and we have no reliable way of identifying which, if any, of the texts in the Hippocratic corpus were by him specifically. What we instead have is this large body of anonymous texts, which were clearly written by a number of different medical writers, none of whom we know the identity of. And if you read through this material, it's clear that they're all working within the same intellectual tradition, but they disagree with one another about all sorts of things. So they're not a monolith. What unites them is that all these doctors want to explain illness in terms of physical processes happening within the body. So they believe that if they can properly identify the imbalances of hot and cold, dryness and moistness, and so on within the body, then they can prescribe an effective therapy and they can cure the patient. So as a result, the Hippocratic doctors diagnose their patients through a slightly jarring combination of precise empirical observation of outwardly visible symptoms and then completely wild speculation about the mysterious internal workings of the body. So, for example, they'll record the volume, the color, the consistency, the smell of the fluids a patient is emitting in a manner which feels to us quite scientific. But then they'll conclude from this that they need to be hung upside down and bled, which is not the conclusion that we would normally draw. So given how rooted Hippocratic medicine was in the physical reality of the patient's condition, the things that the Hippocratic doctor can see and measure, we might expect a fantastical illness like Cleo's multi-year pregnancy not to feature in these texts. But on the contrary, it's actually something that Hippocratic doctors discuss a number of times and something they apparently accounted in their real medical practices. So there are actually women saying, I have been pregnant for several years. So a good example of what a case like this looks like from the Hippocratic perspective is found in a work called Epidemics, and involves the case history of the wife of Gorgias. So epidemics, nothing to do with the modern term epidemics, instead refers to visits. And this is a long work which has loads of these case studies, case histories kind of presented in the same way. So in Larissa, town in central Greece, the menses of Gorgias's wife had stopped for 4 years, save for a very small amount. In her uterus, on whichever side she lay, she had a throbbing and heaviness. She became pregnant and pregnant again. The child was delivered in the 9th month, a live girl with an ulcer on her hip. And the rest came out following, and a very copious flow of blood came on the next and on the 3rd and 4th days, and firm clots. Fever held her for the first 10 days. For the remaining time, she passed bright red blood. She swelled up greatly in the face and calves and feet and one thigh. She had no interest in food, but was very thirsty. She could take very cold water, but no wine. Her belly after the first baby was a little empty, but did not entirely collapse, but was rather hard. But there was no pain. On the 40th day after the second fetus aborted, simply flesh. And her belly collapsed and all the swellings. The flow was white and the blood the odorous sort, and she became healthy. So to summarize what's happened there, this woman had no period for 4 years. She experienced a throbbing and a heaviness in her uterus. A pregnancy then supervened. A healthy daughter was born. There were some postpartum complications, but she survived. So a few things to notice here. First, while the symptoms are similar to Cleo's, the interpretation is very different. Both women report a heaviness in their stomach or uterus, and the same Greek word is used to refer to both in these contexts. But here the doctor carefully distinguishes this from the actual pregnancy because Hippocratic doctors didn't believe pregnancies could last more than 10 months. Second, the focus of the passage is all on precise description of the woman's symptoms. The intended readership here is clearly other doctors. The idea being you give those doctors as much information as possible on this particular case to help them diagnose patients in the future. So the idea is if they've read about a case like this, if they see something similar, they maybe know what's going on. And finally, it's worth thinking about how this doctor got all of this information. So presumably he learned from questioning the woman that her period had ceased for 4 years, except for a small discharge, and that she had felt a throbbing and a heaviness in her uterus. But as for the rest, he must have observed this all while attending the patient. So if we compare how healing sanctuaries and Hippocratic doctors dealt with women reporting multi-year pregnancies, there are some pretty significant differences in how female patients would have experienced these two different modes of healing. The first big difference is that Asclepius accepts female self-diagnosis at face value, whereas the Hippocratic doctors don't. So a passage from the Hippocratic work on the nature of the child is quite revealing here. So the author says, but any women who believe that their time of gestation is more than 10 months, for I have heard this said many times, have been misled in the way I'm about to explain. And what he basically suggests is in all of these cases, the period has ceased, and then some other physical process has led to them thinking that they're pregnant, and then when they later actually do become pregnant, they date back when their pregnancy started to when their period ceased, rather than the actual point where the pregnancy began. And then he continues on. But women lacking this knowledge and experience reckon their pregnancy from the time when their menses stopped flowing and their uterus became raised. So I think that tells us two quite interesting things. The first is that women typically interpreted these symptoms as evidence that they were experiencing an extended pregnancy. And that's very likely what the wife of Gorgias thought was happening to her. Even if, very clearly her attending doctor did not believe the same thing. Second, though, when faced with this kind of self-diagnosis from women, the Hippocratic doctors were often very dismissive of what their female patients were saying. So as far as these Hippocratic doctors are concerned, women lack the knowledge to understand their own bodies, and they need to have it explained to them what's really going on. Now, it's hardly surprising that male doctors in classical Greece had a dismissive attitude towards their female patients when they offered opinions on what was wrong with them. That's hardly limited to classical Greece. But what's interesting is that, as we learn from another Hippocratic text, 8 Months Child, female patients often felt pretty confident in the knowledge that they had about their own bodies and didn't just automatically accept a doctor's authority on the subject. So this is clearly a different author from the previous one, who takes quite a different attitude. You should not distrust women about their giving birth, for they always say the same thing, and they say what they know. They are not to be persuaded by either fact or argument to believe anything contrary to what they know is going on inside their own bodies. Although it is possible there may be some, i.e. doctors, who wish to assert something different, in fact, women who possess judgment and who furnish the most convincing arguments on this subject always say explicitly that they give birth in the 7th month, the 8th month, the 9th month, the 10th month, and the 11th month, and that of these children, those born the 8th month do not survive, whereas the others do. So we know that Hippocratic doctors happen to be right that multi-year pregnancies aren't a real thing, and that these women have simply misinterpreted their symptoms. Although it's worth noting that the reason why the Hippocratic doctors think it's not a thing is because they believe there's a limited food supply in the womb. So they don't actually have the right reason for that. But what I instead want to kind of focus on here is that the way the Hippocratic doctors dismiss the sincerely held beliefs of their female patients creates conflict in the doctor-patient relationship. And that's a kind of conflict which simply doesn't exist in temple medicine, because Asclepius doesn't challenge women's knowledge about their own bodies. If Cleo says she's been pregnant for 5 years, the priests of Asclepius are not going to tell her anything different. The second big difference is that temple medicine doesn't really create any problems for female modesty, whereas Hippocratic medicine really does. So the Hippocratic focus on understanding physical processes within the body means that the Hippocratic doctors need to ask intrusive questions, and they need to personally examine the patient. And when that patient is a woman, this goes against every social norm and taboo in Greek society. So, we know as more general context that respectable Greek women, firstly, were not meant to be named in public. So this is why we don't learn the name of the wife of Gorgias. She's just referred to as the wife of Gorgias. It would be disrespectful to say what her actual name was. Secondly, Greek women were meant to avoid mixing with men they weren't related to as much as possible. And thirdly, they were expected to completely cover their bodies and be veiled in public. So a very typical example of the normal Greek attitude is found in a passage from Euripides' tragedy Hippolytus. The nurse can't work out what ails the lovesick Phaedra, who is clearly too ashamed to tell her what's wrong with her. So she says, if your illness is one which is unmentionable, i.e. gynecological, here are women to help set it to rights. If your misfortune may be spoken of to men, speak so that the thing may be revealed to doctors. So I think that sheds quite important light on a revealing comment in the Hippocratic work on diseases of women, where a doctor complains that female patients are uncooperative when their ailment is gynecological. So here's the passage. So the author says, these conditions are, as has been indicated, dangerous and in most cases acute, serious and difficult to recognize, since they are occurring in women who sometimes only grasp themselves what their disease is when they have become familiar with the disorders that arise from menstruation and are older. By then, both the necessary sequence of events and time itself have taught them the causes of these diseases. Sometimes in women who do not know the source of their illness, diseases have become incurable before the physician learned correctly from a patient the origin of the disease. Besides, women may be ashamed to speak out, even if they know, since the matter seems shameful to them due to their inexperience and ignorance. So the doctor here is, I think, quite unfairly criticizing his female patients for feeling ashamed to talk to him about these things. This should hardly come as a surprise to him. Everything in Greek society tells these women to feel ashamed in this situation. And the fact that they're responding in that way is completely to be expected. So as we sort of are seeing here, the experience of being treated by a Hippocratic doctor for a gynecological illness would have been profoundly uncomfortable for many Greek women. They were being asked to talk about things they wouldn't even want to discuss with their own male kin, with a man that they barely knew. They then had to endure either that man or his female attendant examining the most private parts of their body. And then, to add insult to injury, when they explained to this doctor what they thought was actually wrong with them, he had the cheek to condescendingly lecture them about their own bodies. By contrast, none of this was ever an issue in temple medicine because Asclepius, as a god and therefore the perfect physician, had no need of detailed observation to make a correct diagnosis. He didn't ask his female patients difficult questions because he didn't need to in order to cure them. So to conclude, let's return to the issue of authority, which I discussed at the start. As we've seen, both temple medicine and Hippocratic medicine were keen to establish their authority as successful methods of healing. However, in the case of temple medicine, this authority rests on the power of the god and doesn't have anything to do with what patients think about their illness. The only time we see hostility towards patients of temple medicine is when they doubt the power of the god, like Ambrosia of Athens did. So as a result, temple medicine is more happy to validate women's understanding of their body, whatever that may happen to be. By contrast, the authority of the Hippocratic doctors rests precisely on their method of diagnosing illness through observation and the validity of their theories about the internal workings of the body. And as a result, when female patients resisted the intrusive diagnostic methods of the doctors and disagreed with the doctors' understanding of their bodies, they were challenging the authorities of these doctors in the most fundamental way possible. Thanks for listening.
Aneurine, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating, and lots of questions coming in. So let me start with one of them, which asks, were there any skeptics of Asclepian healing in the ancient world, and how did they critique the practice?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, for someone for a case like Ambrosia of Athens to be in there, clearly there are people in Greek society in the classical period who don't totally trust this stuff. by and large, what's interesting is that it's not the doctors who trust this, so that there isn't a kind of religion versus science type conflict here. Quite a lot of Hippocratic doctors make dedications at sanctuaries of Asclepius. But where I think it probably comes in more is the sort of suggestion that maybe, because there is a fairly obvious financial motive to temple medicine, that whatever the actual power of the gods, the people we need to be really worried about here are the priests, who obviously personally benefit from getting more people to spend money and stuff. So I think when you do see criticism, it's usually not of the god as such, but rather of the priests running the sanctuaries.
Thank you. There seem to be not surprisingly, lots of contradictions here. Societies which need to, as it were, treasure women because of the importance of procreation, but women not involved in medical practice as such, then not listening to women and not actually understanding what is happening in women's bodies. Did that begin to change in ancient Greece at all, or is that a much more modern phenomenon?
I don't think so. I think if anything, what's particularly interesting about this period is the men in this situation sort of put themselves in various intellectual binds, which they would rather not be in. And then, to their great relief, they resolve that and can be much more straightforwardly patriarchal thereafter. So a good example is, and this was like a theoretical aspect that I didn't bring into the talk, but Hippocratic doctors think that they have a two-body conception of men and women. So they think that men and women are made of fundamentally different flesh. And as a result, as male healers, there is a hard limit to what they know about female illness. And it clearly annoys them that this is the case, because they do have to rely a certain amount on what female patients tell them. And you see that kind of really playing out in these cases. And what happens sort of Aristotle mid-4th century onwards is you get a shift to a one-body model where women aren't understood to be of fundamentally different flesh, but just less fully developed. And that's like brilliant. We no longer have to have a separate arm of medicine for women. We can just treat them as imperfectly created men and move on. So I think that's more the direction of travel, is that there are these intellectual binds they put themselves in where they actually have to talk to the women and listen to them, much to their clear annoyance. And then to their relief, they move past that.
Yeah. And you talked about, the women talk to other women and so on. Was there any concept, for example, of the midwife?
Yeah. So I suppose something as well, which is kind of missing from the way I presented that, is both going to Epidaurus or another major Asclepius sanctuary or getting a Hippocratic doctor in is probably the last resort after you've gone through everything else. And probably a much more normal progression is you realize there's something wrong with you, you talk to your mum or your sister or aunt or whatever. If they can't figure it out, there's the old lady down the road who's been a midwife for 40 years, who's seen it all, and she explains some stuff. And then that's still not working. Okay, now maybe I slip out of the house one evening and I make a dedication in a sanctuary. And then only when it's like, okay, this has now got really serious, I guess we're going to have to tell the men. And so I think that's kind of how this develops, because both of these methods cost money, sometimes quite a lot of money. And particularly with going to sanctuaries of Asclepius, if you are suffering from a really serious chronic illness, the very last thing you want to do is travel hundreds of miles across the Greek world to then camp out in a sanctuary. So I think in those ways that, yes, in the earlier phases of a woman trying to gain treatment for herself, women would be much more prominently featured than they are in this phase.
And in Hippocratic medicine, I mean, how did they define success? I mean, you know, you can see that if you go to the sanctuary, there are all the myths and everything else. But as you're moving towards a more science-based approach, what did they see? What did they judge themselves against?
Yeah, so I think this comes up quite a lot in the epidemics because they're just case histories, and so they're not, they're not saying theoretically this is what you should be doing. They're saying, well, this is what I did, and then that then becomes quite interesting when they fail, and it's okay. Well, and then they either say, well, it was just out of my hands, I couldn't do anything about it, or they say, well, I was told too late in the day. What can you expect? Or sometimes that, so you'll get a range of excuses for kind of what happened. And a very common thing is they will say, well, I was called in far too late in the day. There aren't many moments, you'll be shocked to discover, where they, carefully consider whether they've actually gone about this in the right way.
Yeah,
And one of the issues that they have, and which is a kind of Achilles heel of this Hippocratic style of medicine, it's all of the intellectual energy is focused on the diagnosis. And as far as they're concerned, once the diagnosis is done and they've identified a therapy, you're on your own. It's quite different to some of the other approaches to medicine you get later in the ancient world, where they downplay how much they realistically think they can achieve in diagnosis, and they say, well, let's just keep constant watch over this person, try and understand how things develop and change our minds as we go. And that doesn't really fit with the Hippocratic thing, because they've said, well, only we have the expert knowledge which allows us to perfectly identify what's wrong with you. So they can't exactly turn around and go, oh, actually, I got that wrong, sorry.
yeah. I'm very conscious of time. I'm going to try and squeeze in another couple of questions. One is, did Hippocratic medicine recognize conditions like phantom pregnancy, and how did they interpret such cases?
Yeah, I was actually talking with a colleague about this the other day, because well, so this is complicated because uh, at some level, there must also be cases where the woman is saying that she's been pregnant for a long time, and wasn't, but had a variety of reasons to want to kind of hold at bay the idea that she was ready to bear children again, or equally wanted to give the impression that she was able to bear a child but just couldn't quite finish the pregnancy because of the social pressures on producing children and so on. So, but all of that kind of doesn't really, those kind of social dynamics which must be there and which are there in kind of parallel cases from other societies, don't really come out in the medical text. Because I mean, I think this is one of these sort of slightly kind of kind of sexist blind spots, in the same way the Hippocratic authors take it for granted that infertility is a woman-only issue. And you never have to worry about the idea that the man might be infertile. So I think it's one of those things like that where they almost don't want to kind of think through the implications of that.
Right. We've got a question from Kevin Butler about sources, which I won't put to you now, but I think we could probably pick up after the talk. And then one from Antonia Leder, who says, do you think there's a danger we can project current anxieties about maternity care and gynecology onto our interpretation of women's experiences in ancient Greece? What can we learn from the space created in the temple?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there are obviously you know, points of similarity, which, certainly when I'm teaching this to students, my female students always notice kind of shared experiences that they've had with, talking to doctors and so on. I think though what I wanted to emphasize in the paper is that they originate in quite different places, which are specific to this particular example. So, uh, you know, it's the very specific way in which the authority of both the Hippocratic doctors and the the priests in healing isn't certain, which leads to the anxieties, which then lead to that relationship with the female patients. But even that looks different in those two cases. So, I suppose the point would you sort of put a bow on it. As I said in the talk, there are always going to be anxieties around women's sexuality and female reproductive health, but how exactly they manifest is going to be something which is like kind of culturally, historically specific.
Yeah. We're out of time, but I'm going to give you one very quick one. Do we see sanctuaries of Asclepius specializing in particular illnesses, such as mental illnesses or female health? Or did they do everything?
I think my impression is that they do everything. And just, yeah, I mean, certainly you look at the miracle cures from Epidaurus, and you've got all sorts of different things in there. They don't specialize in one particular thing. And then again, if you look at the dedications, particularly body part dedications, those are kind of quite, perfectly varied and stuff. So I don't get the impression that there's specialization, but I would have to think about that a bit further.
Aneurine, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. A huge amount of interest, lots and lots of questions. We couldn't get through them all, but thank you. I think we'll all be doing a little bit more digging now to find out more about this subject. Thank you to all of you for joining us and for your questions. We hope to see some of you at the George Cawkwell Memorial Lecture on the 6th of March at the Faculty of Classics. Do join us next time. And Aneurine, thank you. And thank you everyone again. Good evening.